Welcome to another episode of the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. A progressive insight into Michigan's political and cultural world. And of course, an entertaining podcast designed to shine a light on how to make Michigan's political machine work for the people. Now, from the Left of Lansing headquarters, located in his attic, here's the award-winning Pat Johnston.
Oh, yeah. Welcome to another edition of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. I am Pat Johnston, who is stunned, I tell you, that we're learning that hiring Fox News weekend hosts might not have been the most quality of ideas. I know, call me crazy. In my Friday short last week, I talked about how President Elon and dear leader Trump's assault on minorities in our country caused the deletion of Baseball Hall of Famer and Army vet Jackie Robinson from the Defense Department's website. It was all done in their efforts to trash diversity, equity, and inclusion programs inside the federal government. And that meant the temporary erasure of one of the most important figures of the 20th century and in all of American history. And I told you that Musk, Trump, and their merry band of white Christian nationalist corporate authoritarians needed to erase Jackie Robinson's name because he is the perfect example of why DEI programs existed in the first place. Because, you see, without DEI, you end up with pathetic drunks like Pete Hegseth as your Secretary of Defense. I said those very words just last Friday, and then this week, we learned how Hegseth accidentally shared plans of a military attack on Yemen with the Atlantic's editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg as part of the regime's group chat on the Signal app. I mean, Hegseth laid out in advance, I'll say that again, in advance, when the bombings would begin. Now, had Goldberg been, I don't know, anybody else, those plans could have been handed over to Putin or whoever else, putting our pilots at risk. I mean, can you just imagine? Just imagine had this happened under Biden's Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who is black. Can you imagine had Lloyd Austin shared classified information on an unsecured device? Can you just imagine the uproar in MAGA land? The entire MAGA Republican messaging machine would have called him a DEI failure. Hell, they essentially did that anyway. Now, while I don't support the bombings the United States has been doing in Yemen through several administrations, and that's something I'll get to at a later point, this Signalgate episode simply shows how incompetent these fools truly are. If you want to know what happens when you put white Christian nationalists in power, people who really believe that white people are the only ones qualified, who are always the most qualified in their eyes, and who are in a rush to make the history of marginalized Americans disappear, well, here you go. This is what happens. But as I, and I'm sure many of you expected, the Elon Trump regime doubled down, refused to take any kind of responsibility, and it also had Fox News and countless MAGA influencers backing their failure and their incompetence, which is extremely strange considering how for many years and years I was told that MAGA Republicanism demonstrated how they were the party of responsibility, yet they never take responsibility for anything. It's always about doubling down. It's always about lying and obfuscation. And it's always threatening others who question their so-called wisdom and their brilliance. Which is why you shouldn't just sit back and relax because they're going after people with green cards. Because if they can do that, you really think they won't try to go after American citizens who are protesting them? But what did you expect would happen when we elected an adjudicated criminal as our president? And before I forget, I was listening to Clay Kane on Sirius Radio, and he has an awesome show there. He asked a question to his audience that I'd like to share with you. It's just something that I was thinking about. It makes some sense. He asked, was this whole episode done, this Signalgate episode done, to keep the chaos going? To keep flooding the zone with chaos after chaos after chaos? Because then we can't concentrate on just one thing. I don't give these guys that kind of credit considering how they forgot that there was a member of the press in their chain on an unsafe network, or did they? But I got the sentiment of the question that Clay Kane was asking because, I mean, this Signal Gate certainly got all those stories about how Social Security is being cut in half right now and that's losing many, many workers who are being laid off thanks to Elon Musk. And because of that, it's no wonder why we're seeing regular Americans, hardworking Americans, peacefully protesting at Tesla dealerships. And it's maybe why his stock is crashing down faster than his SpaceX rockets. Like I said last week, there's no reason to vandalize Tesla dealerships or vandalize your neighbor's Tesla car or truck, especially, if they bought those trucks before he joined forces with MAGA Republicans. There's no reason for it because we are the ones who protest peacefully, but also he's doing a hell of a job damaging his own company on his own. Yet I just have to say this because this is something I can't believe is happening. Well, I mean, that's a broken record. I guess I say that every week now. But we had the Attorney General of the United States of America, the inept nutjob Pam Bondi, threatening Texas Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett this week as she told Crockett to tread carefully when criticizing Trump. No, when criticizing Elon Musk. Tread carefully, huh? Tread carefully. And later on, Bondi would tell Sean Hannity on Fox News the following here this week.
After she said that about Elon, she said, well, I didn't mean violence, but, however, your words have consequences. And what happened after she said that about Elon Musk, she's a Texan in her own home state. After she said that, this morning, 3 explosive devices were found in Austin, Texas. So she needs to unequivocally denounce the violence. She must apologize immediately, not only to all Texans, but to our country, to the American shareholders of Tesla.
Jasmine Crockett has to apologize to the American shareholders of Tesla? The shareholders of Tesla? What? So Jasmine Crockett has to forego her First Amendment free speech rights because of the American shareholders of Tesla? And what was Crockett's supposed crime? Because, Crockett criticized Elon's attack on our government. She joined a national takedown Tesla effort in a way to boycott what Elon and Dear Leader are doing to the working class. So that is her supposed crime for saying that we should take down Tesla in non-violent ways. And, I just love how these same MAGA people just recently loved hurting Budweiser due to the fact that a trans woman was promoting their crappy beer. And still, my favorite part of that whole episode was how MAGA Republican beer drinkers rushed to drink Modelo, which is owned by the same company. Oh, God. But also, Modelo was Mexico's top beer. And here were these America First people drinking imported Mexican beer. I've said it many times. Cognitive dissonance is a primary feature for MAGA Republicans. Meanwhile, Tesla's stock price is falling, and top shareholders are now saying maybe it's time for Elon to leave. For example, the CEO of Gerber Kawasaki Wealth and Investment Management, Ross Gerber, who has $105 million in stocks at Tesla, said that it's time for Elon to step down since he's focused more on his new government job. Oh, wait. Is Pam Bondi going to tell Ross Gerber to tread carefully? Is she going to cry and complain how Ross Gerber must apologize to his fellow shareholders? I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably not. And here's a newsflash for Pam Bondi. We don't work for Tesla. The American taxpayer does not work for Tesla, although we do give Tesla and SpaceX billions and billions in subsidies. And how come while Elon and his tech bros attack Social Security, Medicaid, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, FEMA, the IRS, and other agencies that help the working class, how come Elon's not going after the billions in wasted money on corporate subsidies, be it in oil and gas, be it in big pharma, big tech, the banksters and others? How come we never hear how Elon is going after the fraud and abuse on these corporate subsidies? Oh, right, because, you see, they are part of his people, his crowd. It's all about protecting his class of people while attacking and attacking and attacking the working class. Well, you see, the working class ain't taking it. And as we've been seeing, thanks to all these protests and rallies like the Fighting Oligarchy rallies by AOC and Senator Bernie Sanders, the people are pissed. Or you just have to look at those empty chair rallies that we're seeing being put on by grassroots organizations. Just last week, I talked with John Dispelder of Traverse Indivisible, and they, along with Leelanau Indivisible, held an empty chair event for their empty suit of a MAGA Republican Congressman, Jack Bergman. In case you don't know, Indivisible is a national group that sprouted hundreds of local chapters throughout the country as they fight against the white Christianist corporate authoritarianism Elon Trump agenda, while also advancing progressive ideals, progressive policies, and especially progressive opposition. The Jack Bergman empty chair event was sold out in Traverse City last Saturday. Again, on a Saturday afternoon, it was sold out, and it had hundreds of more watching online, including yours truly. So if you don't mind, let me play a brief summary of the things that were said there that day, and this video was put together by Traverse Indivisible. Just listen to a little bit of what happened there.
Us being here in this auditorium speaking to a cardboard cutout of you, Jack, I've been reaching out to you for so long. I've been calling. I've been sending emails.
We are represented by a man who is never here for us.
I've tried contacting you several times with no success.
You don't live in Michigan. Get honest.
I've been desperately trying to get in contact with you through email, voicemail, snail mail. So I'm so glad you could come tonight. Our economy is faltering, nearly failing after just 2 months of chaotic administration.
Are you okay with another branch of government taking over your budget and slashing it at the expense of our Constitution, safety, and place in the world as a global leader?
Why are you abdicating your job?
We need a congressman that will stand up and say, these are the funds that Congress has allocated, and they deserve to go where they to be spent.
Elon and his dodgy Doge are destroying things that have been built up over 100 years.
Why is a tax cut for billionaires who do not need tax cuts more important to you than family farms, feeding our communities, building strong local economies, and supporting resilient food supply chains?
And firing people from the FAA? How's it going flying these days, Jack?
I'm not yet drawing my Social Security, but I worry that that may be privatized.
The day after the inauguration was the 1-year anniversary of my 19-year-old nephew's death. And the kind of cuts that are happening to our medical and scientific research, the kinds of research that could have possibly improved his quality of life and extended his life, it's gut-wrenching. These are not abstract consequences. There are people on the other ends of these decisions and the folks who love them.
Let me tell you, it was moving to watch all of those people there that day, spending their time sharing their stories and letting others know they aren't alone. These are everyday people living, working, and scraping by because of a system that's rigged not for them, but for Elon Musk and the corporate donor class, the class that celebrated that we elected a criminal back into the White House and celebrated that the MAGA Republicans they financed in their races are now the majority in Congress and also have the majority in the Michigan State House. Oh, and let's not forget how they celebrated how they helped bankroll a right-wing MAGA Supreme Court majority as well. Don't forget that part. Congressman Jack Bergman, by the way, has not held a town hall event for his constituents since 2017. And yet he's voting to hurt the very people in his district who rely on Social Security, food stamps, and Medicaid since, let me remind everyone, 120,000 Medicaid recipients in Michigan live in rural areas. You really think MAGA Jack Bergman cares about you? Now, in the mid-Michigan region, my congressman, MAGA John Molinar, isn't holding town halls either. That coward is hosting a virtual town hall event this week, but he won't dare do any in-person town hall events. The only in-person thing he really does anymore is just walks in parades and things like that. Last week, the good people of Indivisible Central Michigan held an empty chair town hall event of their own for the spineless John Molinar. Listen to this one story.
I am an Air Force veteran. So is my husband. We've been married 30 years, been together 31 years. We met in the Air Force when I was 19 and he was 21, and we've been together all that time. Mr. Molinar, the Department of Veterans Affairs saved my life, and it saved many other veterans' lives. I attempted suicide in 2019 because of military sexual trauma that happened when I was in the military. You say that you support veterans. How is cutting 80,000 jobs at the VA going to help a 100% disabled veteran like me? As I said, it saved my life as someone who worked in the Veterans Resource Center at Central Michigan for 10, 11 years and worked with veterans. I saw the impact that getting their GI Bill did for them every single day and getting their veterans benefits. I can tell you, sir, that you being spineless and not doing anything to help the people that work at the VA who are veterans themselves, you showed no courage. Thank you.
Yeah, they always say they care about the veterans when they don't. And then listen to another John Molinar constituent.
I have called Molinar's office multiple times and have received only 2 generic little emails to calm my concerns, and that they did not. My son has level 3 autism and is enrolled in Medicaid. He receives occupational therapy and speech services and requires a communication device to talk. If he loses his Medicaid due to cuts, John Molinar, what's going to happen to my son? He depends on these services to improve his life, his quality of life, for when I'm no longer able to be his voice. What's going to happen to him when he turns 18 and there's no Social Security disability for him? Who's going to take care of him? How will he survive without me someday when I'm gone? As you all saw, my mother has cancer and Parkinson's. She depends on her Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Without those services, she's going to die. What are you, John Molinar, going to do to protect my mom? What are you, John Molinar, going to do to protect my son? Why are you, John Molinar, bowing down to Trump instead of protecting us, your constituents? You were elected to serve us, not Donald Trump.
Do you all remember when MAGA Republicans claimed to be the populist party, the working class party? How can you be the party of the people when you fail to ever be with your constituents? If allowing the richest guy in the world to ransack our government, shuffling through all of our personal data and buying politicians to do his and his corporate friends' bidding is what you think is populism, John, then let me tell you, you failed at basic reading comprehension. And worse, you fail the people you supposedly serve. This week, the Michigan Public Service Commission approved another Consumers Energy hefty price rate hike of over $150 million, which, believe it or not, was less than what Consumers Energy asked for. I mean, they wanted more than that. Now, that prompted MAGA Republican State Senator Eric Nesbitt of Porter Township, which is, I think, southwest of Three Rivers by the Indiana border. That caused Nesbitt to storm on Elon's site, declaring how this rate hike was all thanks to Governor Whitmer. Now, I've shared my disdain for Whitmer's reliance on corporate subsidies and corporate welfare, which hasn't produced the jobs that corporate lobbyists promised. I will always keep it real with you, everybody. But Eric Nesbitt, who's also running for governor, is such a clown because he didn't want to tell his people how he gets nice bribes from Consumers Energy and also DTE. And thanks to our good friend Joe Spalding for posting this on Elon's site, Eric Nesbitt received $44K from DTE or Consumer Energy PAC since 2017, 44,000. But since Eric's suddenly now a man of the people, perhaps he'd like to join our good friend, Progressive Democratic State Representative Dylan Wagala's bill to keep DTE and consumers from donating to Michigan politicians. How wonderful. What outstanding news. What a breakthrough that Eric has suddenly had. You see, that's a working class bill. And see, that's why Eric Nesbitt's not backing the bill. He's an empty suit for DTE and for Consumers Energy. He won't touch it because he doesn't care about the working class. You see, they're attacking all of us here in the working class on a multitude of levels, be it financially, be it medically, or be it constitutionally. PayPal co-founder and tech bro billionaire Peter Thiel is the guy who basically bankrolled J.D. Vance's political career. So that essentially means that he's the VP to Elon Musk, who bankrolled dear leader Trump. Now, Peter Thiel once said the following, and I quote, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." I'll repeat that. I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. Now, that's an irrefutable belief amongst these tech bro authoritarians. They do not believe in democracy. They believe that people should have no say in their government and that we should all believe in their great abilities and their God-given talents that we all supposedly don't possess. Knowing that they believe freedom and democracy are incompatible, dear leader Trump this week released another executive order. And VoteBeat.org reports, and I quote, President Trump issued a sweeping executive order that would dramatically change the administration of U.S. elections, including requiring people to prove their citizenship when registering to vote. But experts and voting rights advocates said that they expect the order to face quick legal challenges. The order, titled Preserving and Protecting the Integrity of American Elections, also would change the certification standards for voting systems, potentially forcing states to rapidly replace millions of dollars in voting equipment, and it would prohibit the counting of ballots postmarked by Election Day but received afterwards, which 18 states and Washington, D.C. currently permit. So, of course, this executive order, like the story says, will go to court, but you see how Musk and Trump are trying to federalize our election process, which is interesting considering how I always heard how states' rights was vital to this country. Yet again, though, it shows how MAGA Republicanism holds no real values other than owning libs. The MAGA Republican majority in Congress, by the way, is already trying to pass what they call the SAVE Act, which also forces all Americans to produce some kind of proof of citizenship, which places more burdens on people in order to vote. And in Michigan, thanks to Nepo baby Brian Posthumus, the MAGA Republican state representative sponsored a bill which forces people to find or to have to spend money to get documents just to vote. And it's all because they don't believe in democracy, and they want to stymie voting in our state one way or another. Now, you see, non-citizens are already not allowed to vote in this country, and study after study shows that this is not an issue, but they're coming after the vote, which is just another plank in their plan to harm the power of the people. Joining me here in just a moment to talk more about this effort in Michigan to force voters to produce some kind of proof of citizenship is VoteBeat.org's Hayley Harden. So stay tuned for that. You are listening to LOL.
He spent nearly 25 years working as a liberal voice in conservative talk radio across the state, and he's still a somewhat stable person. It's the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. You can find archives of the podcast, plus Pat's musings on other topics in written form at leftoflansing.com. Left of Lansing archives are available wherever you get your podcasts. And now Left of Lansing is available on YouTube. We'd like to thank Audio Boom for distributing all our episodes so we can share progressive, otherwise known as common sense, values across Michigan and the country. Now, here's Pat Johnston.
Remember to follow me on YouTube and subscribe there as well. Not only is every episode, every Monday musing, and every Friday short posted there, but I'm posting videos there that you can't get by just subscribing to the podcast. And I know, me on camera, very scary to think about, but hey, it is still there for you. So all you have to do is just search for Left of Lansing and you'll find the show there. Again, like and subscribe to the show on YouTube and wherever you are listening to the show. Subscriptions are important to us in the podcast world. So please subscribe, and if you don't mind, give it a good 5-star review as well. As I said before the break, Michigan Republicans in the State House are pushing a bill to the House floor that would make it law requiring proof of insurance to vote in our elections. Republicans say that making voting a more onerous task will ensure safer elections, even though statistics show that voter fraud or voting by non-citizens is not an issue, but it's their way to chip away at the voter-approved initiatives that we, the people here in Michigan, passed to make voting more accessible for our fellow Michiganders. Joining me now to talk more about this and other voting issues is Hayley Harden, who is a reporter for VoteBeat.org. Hayley, thanks so much for spending some time with us here on Left of Lansing.
Thank you for having me.
what's VoteBeat all about? And, maybe after you talk about that, maybe you can talk about what made you interested in covering stories related to voting and voting rights.
Yeah, so VoteBeat is a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom that covers democracy, election, and voting. That's all we write about, which is it offers us a chance to go really, really deep on issues like these that relate to how you cast your ballot and how that process works for you. I personally am interested in that because I grew up in Michigan. I am a Michigan native, and I care very deeply about how our democracy works. I care a lot that Michigan is the best version of itself. I like this job I have.
Very good. Can I ask where you grew up?
So I am from Warren originally in Macomb County. I moved around a lot to a bunch of different states as a kid. And then in 2021, I came back to Michigan as an adult. I made that choice. I worked for the Detroit News for a few years, and now I'm with VoteBeat.
Well, as you heard in my intro there, we were talking about this bill making its way through the Republican majority in the state house, and it's a bill requiring proof of citizenship in order to vote here in Michigan. And in your VoteBeat story on this bill, I think you wrote that it took just 90 seconds for Republicans to pass it in the so-called House Election Integrity Committee, and I think it was a 6-3 vote, and it now goes on to the full House. So can you expand a bit about what this bill is all about, including how it would amend or be an amendment to our state constitution, and also why Republicans are fighting to get this bill passed?
Yeah, so House Joint Resolution B, which is its full title, effectively seeks to require new voters to show some sort of proof of citizenship when they register to vote, proof that they are legal U.S. citizens. The bill does not expressly say what that might be. It leaves it up to a future legislature to resolve that. It also would require that the Secretary of State's office, who runs elections in the state of Michigan, continually run citizen checks on the 8 million plus voters on our voting rolls to ensure that those people are also all citizens. If the state is unable to verify the citizenship of somebody, it will reach out to that person and they will have some 30 days to show their own proof of citizenship.
Would additional funding be needed for something like this, for the Secretary of State's office to have to go through such process?
It really depends on how exactly it's implemented. It seems to me that that would probably be something that would require additional funding because it would be a lot of work to run these sort of continual citizenship checks. If nothing else, the staffing alone is going to be an expansion over what we have right now. I think it's very difficult to say what the cost of this would be right now because a lot of these details are sort of still nebulous to be resolved by a future legislature.
And of course, for a person to prove citizenship, they would have to produce these documents, which means that is making them do more work. Anyway, like I said in my first question, this bill, the prospects of it passing through the state legislature is pretty much not going to happen, right?
That's probably a pretty fair bet. It does have support from a lot of House Republicans. Almost all of them, some 40-something, have signed on in support as co-sponsors of this bill. But in Michigan, Democrats still have control of the state Senate, and state senators have not expressed any interest whatsoever that I've heard in passage of this bill or even consideration of it. So it's very unlikely that this will probably be on ballots in 2026, but it's probably not going to be from the legislature putting it there.
So then, knowing it won't pass, and that, of course, it needs, 2/3, I think, in the state legislature to pass something that would be amended in our state constitution. Knowing that it won't pass, is it then safe to conclude that the reason State House Republicans are just bringing this to the floor is so that they can give it more exposure, getting it into the news, knowing they would like this to be on the 2026 ballot?
I am not a politician. I'm not a political expert, but I do think that Republicans have really positioned themselves as the party of election security, election integrity, as they've renamed the House Elections Committee, as they've taken control of the House once again. And I think this is one of those signals to voters of, hey, we are doing what you put us in office to do, which is to promote election integrity, even in ways that I think outside experts have said maybe aren't the most functional way to do it.
Hayley, I'm not sure what you can say here with my next question. I get it, but it's just something I brought up during the previous segment. I was talking about this signature gathering effort that's being done by a group calling itself Prove It Michigan, and you've brought it up in some of your stories. Do you know who is affiliated with this Prove It Michigan group? Because the only thing I've been able to find so far is that its spokesman is a guy named Fred Wozolek, and he worked for the Republican Michigan Senate Majority Communication Office when Republicans had control of the state Senate. And he's worked in Republican PR circles for a long time. But do you know any others who are behind this Prove It Michigan group?
So Prove It Michigan is still sort of this kind of fuzzy existing group. If you visit their webpage, they have some very basic information, but not a whole lot available yet. They do have some filings that you can track down. If you go to their website, it says they're funded by the Committee to Protect Voters' Rights, which has ties to these efforts back in 2018 to stop what was then Proposal 3, which is one of the major expansions of voting rights that we have seen Michigan voters pass in 2018 and 2022.
Okay. I understand that Republicans and that these Republican affiliated groups, they're making hay over a University of Michigan student from China who did vote, and he's also facing felony charges. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I think the case with the international student really highlights that there was a loophole in this law that we have here. You know, Democrats have said that they are going to try to introduce legislation to fix it themselves, although this was a few weeks ago at this point, I haven't seen anything tangible come from that yet. But I do think that situation does flag that there was a space for something to happen that maybe wasn't considered previously. And I think that a lot of Republicans are saying, the fact that this happened at all is a sign that we don't have sufficient security in our elections. And then I've also heard outside experts and Democrats have said to me, I feel that a lot of people are using the metaphor taking a chainsaw to something that requires a scalpel. Like this is too big a response to something that is, all things considered, many people have studied this. It is very, very rare for somebody who's not a citizen to even try to cast a ballot. Obviously, this exception from this international student shows that it can happen, but it is so exceedingly rare.
Right. I mean, that's kind of was going to be my next question, but thanks for answering it. But I was going to say, it does seem like that they're kind of overdoing it. Yes, that's a problem. Obviously, we don't want non-citizens voting. But first of all, non-citizens are already barred from voting. And the research is showing, right, that non-citizens voting in elections in the United States is not a runaway problem. It is a rare occurrence, as you said, right?
It is exceedingly rare. There is not a drop of evidence that this is some sort of massive scandal or that this is causing some sort of massive election fraud. It does happen, but in my experience talking to these outside experts is oftentimes the type of person who is doing election fraud is in fact the type of person who's trying to flag a problem in the system or otherwise just a person who makes a mistake. Elections are voted in by people. They are run by people. It is a very human process, and that is something that we should broadly enjoy about our elections. So sometimes mistakes do happen, but the vast majority of international residents living in the United States or anyone who is not a citizen is never going to try to cast a ballot, and those who do are so rare and so far between.
I know you said that state Democrats have not introduced anything yet. Neither has Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson. But are you getting a feeling that they may try to push for more provisional ballots for certain people?
Provisionals might be an option. I think that Democrats say that there's a lot of potential to address this loophole that we saw in bright blinding colors when, we found out that this Chinese international student had voted in our election. I think there's Democrats say, we can address this problem without requiring proof of citizenship, which may serve to disenfranchise lots of others. It could be provisional ballots. It could be a variety of things. We haven't seen anything introduced from Democrats yet that would really address this.
No, I hope they do, because it seems like right now Republicans are the only ones doing the talking. You wrote how there is a proof of insurance requirement in states like Arizona. Can you talk more about that law?
Arizona, yes, is a state that does require proof of citizenship, but because that is the simplest way to explain it is federal law does not require documentary proof of citizenship, but Arizona does. So the end result is that Arizona maintains two separate voter rolls, one for people who can only vote in federal elections because they have not shown their documentary proof of citizenship, and those who can vote in all elections because they have shown that proof of citizenship.
That's got to make work harder for the election workers, I'd have to think.
It has proven difficult. It is kind of a tenuous situation in a lot of ways, and most states work very, very hard to avoid having a similar situation.
Another issue that has come up, and it's one that I've also highlighted here on the show a few times, is how this proof of citizenship burden could really affect women who've taken their husband's names. Now, of course, their current names won't then match on what is on their birth certificate. Lansing Democrats have described this as a pink poll tax, since women would have to pay to get extra documents to prove their citizenship. From everything that you've been witnessing, do Republicans have an effective counter-argument to this issue yet?
I think it would depend in Michigan a lot in how such a requirement is implemented, whether or not we would see women disenfranchised. Republicans, Brian Posthumus, who is the floor majority leader and the author and major sponsor of this bill, has said that he would, as a legislator, would not support any sort of implementation that does not allow for married women to use their married name, or anybody who's changed their name, to use their current legal name as part of the process. Though Democrats have said, sometimes people lose their documentation in a fire, sometimes for a variety of reasons. What's on your birth certificate or your social security card simply does not match. And that can be very difficult for people. And outside studies have confirmed this I don't know how many people know off the top of their head where their birth certificate is, where their social security card is, where their passport is. But studies have found that the number of people who couldn't produce it with 24 hours notice is a pretty significant number of people.
Right. And I bet it is a significant amount of people. So then, despite what Brian Posthumus is saying, he's saying, no, that's not going to happen. But it doesn't sound like, from what you just said, that they've really offered any solutions to that or any kind of pushback to that kind of argument yet.
This comes back to the fact that the way that the bill was written, and this was very deliberate, and Brian Posthumus has told me this was very deliberate, he wants it to be worked out by a future legislature because there's a lot of similar bills introduced have gotten caught up in the courts, right? In part because putting too much into these constitutional amendments runs afoul of federal law. So in his efforts, he has very deliberately tried to leave these things more nebulous so that legislators voted in by the people can ultimately make these decisions. The downside of that is, as we're having this conversation right now, a minimum of 2 years out before anything could be formally introduced under this HJRB proposal. We don't have a lot of details. We don't necessarily know what it would look like. And so talking about this is everything that I have to say is, this is what it looks like it could be. This is what it potentially could be. So it's hard to tack down anything solid quite yet.
Very interesting. There's currently a bill in Congress called the SAVE Act, which the Republican majority in the House of Representatives is hoping to pass. And that would also require, I believe, additional documents that voters would have to produce in order to vote. Is the bill that we're talking about in Michigan kind of piggybacking off this congressional bill?
This is similar to the SAVE Act. Yes, the SAVE Act also seeks to require proof of citizenship. There are some key differences. The SAVE Act also might struggle to make it through its own legislative processes, but they are very similar in the idea that federal law already requires that you are a citizen to vote. These proposals both take it one step further and say, okay, prove it.
Okay, then back to the Michigan bill. Do you see House Republicans passing this bill anytime here in the near future?
It could happen at any time. I think that even if it does clear the House, which I think is pretty likely, all things considered, I think once it makes it to the Senate, we won't hear a whole lot more from the actual proposal itself. But as you mentioned earlier, there is this signature gathering initiative known as Prove It Michigan, which is already up and going. I don't believe they're gathering anything quite yet, but they are prepared for when that time comes to try to get this before voters next fall.
And maybe Republicans feel emboldened at this time to pass a bill like this because on the semantics, they seem to be winning, since a recent Gallup poll, right, showed that a significant majority of Americans say that they support such a law when they are asked if everyone should show proof of citizenship.
Yeah, that is an accurate reading of that poll. That poll does show that something like 83% of people believe that you should have to prove citizenship. That is a popular belief. I think that is undeniably a popular belief, that the idea of only citizens should vote in the U.S. elections. I think where some of these question marks come in, if you will, is what form does that take? What does that look like? What is that required of me? What is required of other people? And I think that's where people get a little more, I think that's where, given that we don't have the details, it's really hard to say what the popularity of that might be.
Yeah, I agree. I think those numbers would change if there was a good counter effort to proposals such as this. We'll see. While I still have you here just for a couple more moments, I wanted to bring up that terrific and insightful story that you wrote on the trials and tribulations of being an election worker in Michigan and across the country in a story titled on VoteBeat. It's called "Michigan is Short of Clerks to Oversee Elections, but Harassment and Workload Turn People Away." Can you just give an overview for everyone of what you learned from that story, and maybe give a few facts that people may not know of when it comes to being a city clerk and the reasons why people just aren't lining up for those positions anymore?
Yeah, I think something that a lot of people don't realize is that Michigan is one of very few states that actually has city and township clerks rather than simply county clerks. I think it's something like 42 states across the US only have county clerks who run elections for an entire county. So the end result is that a state like California has maybe 100 and something clerks. I don't know the number off the top of my head. And in Michigan, we have something like 12 or 1,300. But it's a lot of people to do this job. But this job is a lot of work. This job does not pay particularly well. This job comes oftentimes with threats against the work you're doing, threats against your family, threats against your life are not unheard of. And the pay sucks. It's a public service job. It's not something that you get into for the money. And the end result is that as we've seen a new generation of clerks sort of retire out, say, this is not worth it to me anymore. I cannot maintain these expanded hours. I cannot maintain these additional things that have been put on me in the past few years. I can't maintain the money, if nothing else. As we've seen clerks sort of retire out of the job, there hasn't been, a huge line behind them to potentially replace them. And that's a huge problem in Michigan because these are the people who are running your elections. These are the people who are making sure that your votes are handled legally and properly and counted.
In your story, you wrote about how clerk races featured only one candidate. And I think you said that a study found that 90% of clerk races just have one candidate. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a few reasons for that. One is that oftentimes single parties have strong control on local cities. Detroit is an overwhelmingly Democratic city, and, in other smaller communities, we see overwhelmingly Republican cities. So that's not totally out of the realm of possibility. But I think in these more purple places, if you will, it says a lot that oftentimes there's just one person and nobody else wants to do the job. And even if you don't really like that person's probably going to be your clerk because nobody else is lining up to do it. I think is a conversation worth having of are we able to get the best people for the job when we only have one person for the job?
Right. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, low pay, growing demands on the job. Those would be easy reasons right there to understand why many people just don't want to run for their local clerk office. But also another point that you've highlighted is the recent harassment of city clerks. And I'd just like to make it plain for those who are listening, or actually, I would like you to illustrate this last point. Harassing these workers and making them feel scared, I think, is done with the purpose of preventing competent people from running to become a clerk or an election official. I mean, that's the way I'm looking at it. I mean, we've seen this in other areas of public office, be it librarians or health administrators and on and on and on, right? I mean, what's your take on that?
Far be it from me to try to understand the behavior of a person with such a wildly different approach to life than myself. But I will say, I think when it comes to this harassment, I think a lot of people sort of fell into a rabbit hole of misinformation, of disinformation, and now they're in a place where they cannot reconcile what they see in front of them with what they have been told and what they have been led to believe. And I think that's a huge problem, and far be it from me to be the one to resolve it. But I think what we're seeing as a result of this misinformation, this disinformation, is that people assume things are wrong when they are operating completely normally. They can assume people are out for the worst when they are in fact just doing their jobs as is legally required. And I think that is a lot of what has led to this harassment of clerks who aren't in the news, they aren't having any controversies, they're having perfectly smooth elections, are still getting these threats just because I think people are coming from a bad place for a variety of reasons. Like I said, far be it from me to try to understand those reasons, but I think that the effect of misinformation and disinformation cannot be understated when we have this conversation.
In your story, did any of the election officials or the clerks talk to you about what maybe they would like to see happen on a state level to try to help them out when it comes to the workload, when it comes to maybe even pay, for example, or the harassment that they have to deal with?
I think a lot of clerks were thrilled to see that in Michigan, it is illegal in certain ways to harass an election official. I think that I'm not sure of many cases where that's actually been used, but even just that kind of looming over people has maybe prevented the very worst of behaviors. But I think in my conversations with clerks, a lot of them want the same things, regardless of party, regardless of personal beliefs. A lot of them want fully funded elections. They want to be able to pay their employees appropriately to help them run these elections. They want to meet the voters where they are in whatever form that takes, but they can't do that if they don't have sufficient staffing, sufficient money, sufficient materials. So I think in my conversation with clerks, what a lot of them are hoping for is just a legislature that recognizes the amount of work that they have and is taking steps to make it possible for them to actually do that work.
All right. Well, we'll keep our eye on what's happening with that bill in the State House. Anything new that we should expect from you on VoteBeat here in the near future, Hayley?
There's always something happening in elections. So I expect that we will see quite a lot. People ask me all the time, they say, what are you going to cover when there's not an imminent election? To which I say, there's always an imminent election. So it's fine. We're okay.
All right. Hayley Harding from VoteBeat.org. Thank you so very much for offering your time and your expertise here to discuss these topics. And please come back again.
Thank you so much.
A podcast devoted to intelligence, sanity, and freedom, or otherwise known as progressive politics. It's Left of Lansing with your host, Pat Johnston. Need to tell Pat where he's wrong? Or do you actually want to praise Pat? leftoflansing@gmail.com is how to reach him. Here's Pat.
Special thanks to Hayley Harding of VoteBeat.org, and I will link to her articles for you wherever you are listening to this podcast and also on YouTube. And I just want to tell you that we recorded this interview just hours before Dear Leader unveiled his anti-voting executive order, and so that's why we didn't say anything about it. But that executive order is part of a three-pronged effort to attack voting rights of many Americans, especially many Michiganders, including that executive order, the so-called SAVE Act, which is running through Congress right now, and of course this House Joint Resolution B that's moving through the State House. And I'd like to read part of this statement on behalf of many progressive groups and activists in Michigan. It was a statement released by our good friends over at Progress Michigan, and it was signed on by many other progressive groups and activists, and I'd like to read part of it here. It's more clear than ever that our voting rights are under attack. House Joint Resolution B, a ballot initiative, the SAVE Act, and President Trump's executive order. Different names, different levels, and levers of government, but in the end, all the same, burdensome anti-voter policies driven by election denialism that threaten to disenfranchise tens of thousands of Michigan voters and millions of voters across the country. Michiganders have repeatedly voted in record numbers on measures to improve access to voting, not build more barriers between voters and the ballot box. Our elections have plenty of checks and balances, and Michiganders know adding more barriers to the system will only result in eligible voters being unfairly prevented from voting. And you see, that's what this is all about, limiting and creating barriers to voting. And so that's going to be this week's Left of Lansing Last Call. I think you heard me say during the interview with Ms. Harding that Michigan Republicans have been the only ones doing the talking for the most part when it comes to this joint resolution, this proof of being an American voting bill. Now, I understand that some Democrats have certainly denounced this bill and how it'll attack married women, and it will also hurt people who don't have their birth certificates on hand or at the ready to produce. And as Ingham County Clerk Barb Byram told Harding and her colleagues at VoteBeat.org, this proof of citizenship bill puts burdens on both the voter and voting officials in towns across the state. Many clerks, you see, work part-time, and voters would then have to work around their clerk schedules to produce birth certificates or passports. Many people don't have that kind of time. Again, it's all about barriers. And here's more from that VoteBeat story. Quote, "This would impact Michigan rural voters tremendously," Barb Byram said. And she said she thought such a requirement could be the end of online voter registration. an automatic registration which Michigan residents use when they get a driver's license or state ID. That appears to be essentially nullified, said Canton Township Clerk Michael Segrist. Segrist would also go on to say that due to a gross misunderstanding of how safe our elections really are here in the state, the workload for election workers has increased and would only continue to increase thanks to these MAGA Republican draconian laws. And I wanted to highlight this part of the story. Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes said this move is done to make it look like Dear Leader's 2020 loss was illegitimate and that you can cancel an election if it doesn't go his way. Fontes said, you have to pay attention not to what the executive order says, but what the end game may be. I believe the end game may be that Donald Trump wants to stay in office in perpetuity. You think? Michigan's Secretary of State Democrat Jocelyn Benson, who's also running for governor, said that she'd see him in court if the election denier-in-chief tries to interfere with our vote. Not bad, but it is time for Democrats to explain this and make this a major issue because, like you heard Ms. Harding say, a recent Gallup poll showed that 80% of Americans support these MAGA Republican efforts. That's because they don't know what's in them. They just hear proof of citizenship and they're like, oh yes, of course, I will agree with that, not knowing exactly how this will harm voters. And that's why Michigan Democrats should offer a counterproposal to that MAGA bill that's traveling through the Michigan House. And the Democrats' bill would help close the loophole that allowed for that one, and I will say again, one international student to vote at the University of Michigan, and he has been since charged with a felony. This election system is working, and Democrats have to fight for that system. They have to be out there all of the time talking about it. And hey, we also have to do our job at talking about it. And I still do say that once these bills start to go through and people realize there's more to it than just this proof of citizenship and how it's going to hurt a lot of people, those numbers will start to go down. But it is up to Democrats to get the voice out there, to make the argument, and to let the people know exactly how MAGA Republicans are attacking the right to vote. I mean, you remember, everyone, we all had to hear about Antrim County during the 2020 election, where there was a glitch in that northern Michigan county that recorded more votes for Joe Biden than Trump, but the glitch was found and fixed by election officials. So the system worked. But even though the system worked, that proved to MAGA land that there had to be a massive conspiracy out there. And that's why Trump lost. Now, of course, all of the MAGA Republicans who won office in Congress or statewide seats, they seem to believe, though, that their elections were still legitimate. Funny how that works, right? Like I said, corporate authoritarians who bankroll these MAGA politicians don't believe in democracy, and they want to make it harder for the working class American out there to vote. They want to make it harder for working class Americans to use their voice. I mean, that's why Elon contributed $2 million to the MAGA Wisconsin Republican Party just ahead of its crucial state Supreme Court race there. You see, if the Wisconsin Supreme Court tips towards a Republican majority, a MAGA Republican majority, then it will help place all kinds of roadblocks and barriers to voting. That is what MAGA Republicanism is about. They want to remove the people's power to protest and the people's right to vote. Democrats have to speak on behalf of the people, and they have to speak forcefully. That's why the people are begging for Democrats to lead, and that's why millions across the country are begging Democrats to hear their voices. These rich, authoritarian elitists are trying to remove our rights, and it's not like they're trying to hide it. MAGA Republicans claim that they're about freedom and democracy, but you know better.
You're listening to the Left of Lansing podcast. The music you're hearing is by Wanderbeats. To hear the latest project, check out Space Leopard on your favorite streaming site. Now back to our favorite progressive voice in Michigan. It's Pat Johnston.
Well, that's going to do it for this edition of The Left of Lansing. We've been dealing with some heavy issues here today, so let's end on a slightly different note as the Detroit Tigers take on the world champion Los Angeles Dodgers later on tonight as they open up the 2025 season, which means I have to give you my annual Detroit Tigers prediction, which means you can never, ever take my predictions to the bank. I'm no expert, but I have a little knowledge. So with that, I will say despite some early season injuries and a difficult schedule to begin the year, the pitching staff led by Cy Young Award winner Tarek Skubal will help the Tigers tread water here for the first 6 weeks. Then, as the weather begins to heat up and they get some of their outfielders back from injury, that's when the Tigers will start to heat up and they won't look back. They'll start to play far better baseball sometime around June 1st, and they will find a way to win the American League's Central Division crown. In addition, I'm predicting Kerry Carpenter, Riley Green, Gleyber Torres, and, yes, Spencer Torkelson will each hit 20 home runs, while Skubal wins 17 games on the mound with Jack Flaherty pulling in 15 wins. And with that, I will say the Detroit Tigers will amass 89 wins this season, and that will be enough, again, to win the Central Division. So go Tigers. Special thanks again to Hayley Harden from VoteBeat.org for being on the show this week. Make sure to let as many people know across Michigan how MAGA Republicans are trying to make voting more and more difficult for those of us in the working class. And also, if you ever need to reach me, it's leftoflansing@gmail.com. Until next week, remember, take the battle to them. Thank you, Michigan.
The Left of Lansing podcast was produced by Pat Johnston, written by Pat Johnston, researched by Pat Johnston, edited by Pat Johnston, and hosted by, yes, Pat Johnston. Technical assistance by Dr. Heather. And thanks to our good friend Kirsten for the awesome podcast logo. Remember to visit leftoflansing.com for more news and information. Thanks again for listening to the Left of Lansing podcast.